This episode is brought to you by Mug Root Beer. It's 3 p.m. on a Thursday. Too late for a coffee, too early for a beer. So you walk around aimlessly in search of a mysterious third beverage. That's when you hear it. The sound of the dog. The sound of Mug Root Beer. So drink Mug Root Beer if you got that dog in you.
This episode is brought to you by Rakuten. If you're shopping while working, eating, or even listening to this podcast, then you know and love the thrill of the hunt. But are you getting the thrill of the best deals? Rakuten shoppers do. They get the brands they love with the most savings and cash back. And you can get it too. Start getting cash back at your favorite stores like Samsung, Expedia, and Sephora. And even stack sales on top of cash back. It's easy to use, and you get your cash back through PayPal or check. The idea is simple. Stores pay Rakuten for sending them shoppers, and Rakuten shares the money with you as cash back. Download the free Rakuten app and never miss a deal. Or go to Rakuten.com to start getting the most bang for your buck. That's Rakuten.
Thanks for listening to the Red Treehouse, where I tell scary stories to keep you up at night. You can listen to the Red Treehouse on your favorite streaming platforms, including Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Be sure to follow, like, and subscribe. Oh, and leave a 5-star review. You can follow the Red Treehouse on social media, on TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, and X at Red Treehouse Pod. And if you have a scary story or topic you'd like me to feature on an upcoming episode, email redtreehousepod@gmail.com. Important note: sources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Content warning: this episode contains descriptions of extreme violence, including the murder of children and adults. Listener discretion is advised. In 2021, there were 21,156 homicides across the United States. A breakdown of the numbers reveals California, Texas, Illinois, Pennsylvania, and Georgia had the highest number of homicides. As if that weren't unsettling enough, there's another number that's equally scary. According to FBI statistics analyzed by the Murder Accountability Project, in 2021, 50% of all homicides nationwide went unsolved. If you focus in on larger cities across the United States, the number of unsolved homicides jumps to nearly 65%. Of the states in the bottom half of the data, Iowa has the distinction of being among the 12 states with the fewest homicides, and is an unlikely candidate for arguably the most infamous and still unsolved mass murder in U.S. history. Sometime between the evening of June 9th and June 10th, 1912, 8 people, including 6 children, were found bludgeoned to death in Villisca, Iowa, with an axe. Even now, over 110 years later, the details of the murders are brutal, and to date, it's the largest unsolved axe murder in United States history. But the story doesn't end there. The home is known as the Villisca Axe Murder House, and is referred to as, quote, one of the nation's most haunted places, end quote. Visitors to the home have reported seeing shadow figures, hearing disembodied voices, footsteps, witnessing poltergeist activity, recording EVPs, and more. And if that weren't enough, in 2014, an amateur ghost hunter was rushed to the hospital after stabbing himself in the chest. In this episode of the Red Treehouse, we're going to explore the Villisca Axe murder the terrifying, brutal case, and the ongoing haunting. Who killed 8 people in June 1912? And if given the chance, would you spend a night alone in the infamous Villisca Axe Murder House? I'll share the story. You decide for yourself. I'm your host, Will. Welcome to the Red Treehouse. Villisca, Iowa is the quintessential small town. With a population of just over 1,000 people, it sits in the southwest corner of Iowa, about 2 hours from Des Moines. The town is filled with family-owned businesses, friendly neighbors, and quiet living. And it hardly seems like the site of one of the most infamous mass murders of the 20th century. On June 9, 1912, the Moore family, Josiah, age 43, Sarah, age 39, Herman, age 11, Mary Catherine, age 10, Arthur, age 7, and Paul, age 5, left in the evening to attend their local Presbyterian church, where Sarah was directing a children's program. While there, 12-year-old Lena Stillinger and her sister, 8-year-old Ina May, were invited to spend the night. After the service was done, the Moore family and the Stillinger sisters made the short walk back to their home, arriving sometime between 9:45 and 10 p.m. Soon after, they settled in for the night. Early the next morning, Mary Peckham, a neighbor of the Moores, noticed they'd not come out to tend the chickens and to start their morning routine. Concerned, she walked to the Moores' home and knocked on the front door and window, only to find both were locked. Her concern intensified, and she called Ross Moore, Josiah's brother, to let him know of the strange situation. After an unsuccessful attempt to rouse the family, Ross Moore let himself in, using a copy of the house key. He told Mary Peckham to wait outside on the porch while he entered the home, which at this point was eerily quiet despite the noise outside. Ross Moore walked through the parlor to the guest bedroom, with no sight or sound of the family. Then, he opened the guest room. There, he found the Stillinger sisters, lying on the bed and covered in blood. Shocked by the gruesome discovery, he told Mary Peckham to contact Henry Horton, the town marshal, who, after arriving a few minutes later, went through the Moore house room by room. What he discovered was horrifying. The entire Moore family and both Stillinger sisters had been bludgeoned to death in their beds. The murder weapon, an axe, was found on the floor next to the bodies of Ina May and Lena Stillinger. Word of the murder spread like wildfire, and as the details of the murder started to come out, every person in the small town became a potential suspect. The murders were believed to have taken place sometime between 12 a.m. and 5 a.m., and as police searched the home, they discovered 2 cigarettes in the attic. It is widely believed the killer, or killers, found an axe somewhere on the property, slipped into the home while the family was at church, and hid quietly in the attic until everyone returned home and fell asleep. Then, one by one, the killer struck. I offered a content warning at the start of the episode, but I'll give another one here. The following contains graphic descriptions of violence towards adults and children. Listener discretion is advised. Josiah Moore was found brutally beaten with the blunt end of the axe. He received more blows than any other person, and he was hit so many times that his eyes were missing. The attack was so horrific, the ceiling had gouge marks from when the killer raised the axe before bringing it down on Josiah Moore. Sarah Moore was found bludgeoned, but unlike the other victims, the killer used the sharp end of the axe to murder Sarah. All 4 Moore children were murdered in their beds, like their parents. The killer then moved downstairs, where Lena and Ina Mae were sleeping in the guest room. They too were murdered in their beds. It is believed everyone was asleep when they were murdered, except for Lena Stillinger. She had a defensive wound on her arm, indicating she may have fought with her attacker. Her body was also found lying across the bed, and it was initially thought she was sexually assaulted. However, this was later proven false. The investigation into the murders was botched from the start, as the crime scene was contaminated by spectators passing through the home. There were, however, a few interesting oddities. A 4-pound slab of bacon was found, quote, leaning against the wall next to an axe, end quote. The killer had also searched dresser drawers, quote, for pieces of clothing to cover the mirrors in the house and the glass in the entry doors, end quote. One article stated, quote, all the blows were struck above the neck. This was true of all the victims. They had a face cloth over their face, which was a piece of clothing that the killer picked up, and they had the bed clothing pulled over that, end quote. Investigators also found a plate of uneaten food and a bowl of bloody water in the kitchen. As the initial shock wore off, several suspects came to the surface, some of whom were brought in because of a few odd coincidences. Andrew Sawyer was a transient who traveled from town to town, and he showed up on police radar after expressing an obsession with the case. Police soon discovered that Sawyer, quote, slept fully clothed, as if he was ready to make a clean getaway, and slept with an axe by his bed, end quote. Henry Lee Moore was a suspected serial killer who just a few months after the murders in Villisca was convicted of killing his grandmother and mother with an axe. There were startling similarities between the Villisca murders and those of Henry Lee Moore, and while he was considered a suspect, he was never questioned, and therefore never ruled out. Perhaps the most shocking suspect is Reverend George Kelly, a traveling minister who was in town on the night of June 9, 1912. In fact, Reverend Kelly was teaching at the Presbyterian Church the night the Moore family attended service, and it was reported that he left the area sometime between 5 and 6 a.m. on the morning the bodies were discovered. George Kelly was a pervert who, as an adult, had asked several women and girls to pose nude for him. Oh, he also confessed to killing the Moore family and the Stillinger sisters. Shortly after the murder, Kelly exhibited an obsession with the case, writing separate letters to police and family members of the Moores. Eventually, his obsession aroused the suspicion of investigators, who wrote back to Kelly asking for his input on the murders. They were trying to find out what he knew, and if his information matched those obtained during the investigation. Reverend Kelly replied and claimed to have heard sounds and possibly witnessed the murders. His claims were dismissed by investigators because Kelly had no mental illness, and it was widely thought his account was a figment of his imagination. Within a few years, George Kelly was arrested for sending lewd material through the mail. and he was sentenced to St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, D.C. In 1917, George Kelly was arrested for the Villisca murders, and during questioning, police obtained a confession. Kelly claimed the murders were commanded by God, stating, quote, "God had whispered to him to suffer the children to come unto me," end quote. One article stated, quote, "He said it was because, as he was walking in the street that night, and as he drew closer to the Moore house, heard the voice of God telling him to walk further and follow the shadow. The shadow he spoke of led him directly to the Moore house and to the axe in the shed. He then said he was told to, quote, slay them all," end quote. Within a few hours, George Kelly recanted his confession, and though he was tried twice, George Kelly was acquitted both times. To this day, over 110 years later, the murders of Josiah, Sarah, Herman, Mary Catherine, Arthur and Paul Moore, and Lena and Ina Mae Stillinger remain unsolved. It is likely we will never know who killed them. In the years since the murders, the home has been lived in by various owners and tenants. However, it is reported that most did not stay for very long. Today, the home is mostly a tourist location and has the distinction of being one of the most haunted houses in America. The home has drawn considerable attention from ghost hunters, paranormal investigators, and thrill seekers, with several episodes of various ghost hunting shows being filmed on location. Visitors to the home have reported hearing footsteps throughout the house. One article stated, quote, "Almost straight away we heard footsteps downstairs. As they started to come up the stairs towards them, he was convinced that somebody had broken into the house. The heavy footsteps entered the room, so he thought he would scare them by suddenly kicking the door open, expecting to confront an intruder, only to find nobody there," end quote. Others have reported hearing disembodied laughter coming from distant parts of the house, and hearing, quote, "children's voices play over and over like a record, repeating the last night of the lives of the kids in the Villisca home," end quote. EVPs have been recorded over the years and always seem to capture something interesting: children's voices, but never the parents. Some of the scariest reports of paranormal activity have come from those who have visited the attic, where the killer is thought to have hidden while lying in wait. Guests to the home have described it as, quote, "dark and creepy," end quote. One photo of the attic showed a chair in the middle of the room with a stuffed animal placed on top. At first glance, it seems like a regular photo, but a closer look reveals one of the front legs hanging off the floor, as if someone was sitting in the chair and leaning back slightly. Other scary phenomena include unexplained screams, strange shadow figures, unexplained fogs, and possible possessions. On November 7, 2014, a visitor to the home was rushed to a nearby hospital after suffering a self-inflicted stab wound to his chest. Robert Larson, who was visiting from Wisconsin, arrived with several friends to conduct a paranormal investigation. One article described what happened while he was there, stating, quote, "He was alone in the northwest bedroom, and the rest of the party was outside, and he called for help on their mobile two-way radios. His companions found him stabbed in the chest, an apparently self-inflicted wound, called 911, and Larson was brought to a nearby hospital before being helicoptered to Creighton University Medical Center in Omaha," end quote. Paranormal enthusiasts noted the time of the incident, 12:45 a.m., which is said to be the time the Villisca Axe murders took place. Robert Larson has since recovered from his injuries, but by all accounts, has not spoken publicly about what led him to stab himself. To this point, we've covered a few haunted houses, with each claiming to be the most haunted. But truly, the story behind the Villisca Axe Murder House is legitimately terrifying, and the haunting is just icing on the cake. The idea that someone could slip into your home unnoticed and unannounced and wait for you to fall asleep before committing mass murder is among my deepest fears. At least to me, it makes perfect sense that the home is haunted, and that folks from all walks of life have experienced scary phenomenon. Oh, there's something else. You can reserve an overnight tour of the Villisca Axe Murder House for $428 per night for 1 to 6 people, and $75 for each additional person. As we close this episode of the Red Treehouse, we're still left with these lingering questions. Who killed the Moore family and the Stillinger sisters in June 1912? And, if given an opportunity, would you spend the night alone at the Villisca Axe Murder House? I've shared the story. Now you decide for yourself. I'm your host, Will. Thanks for joining me in the Red Treehouse.